Hello my quilting friends, Leah Day here with a new Quilty Box video. I just received my Quilty Box for June 2016 and it's an awesome box of fun gear picked by Heather Gavins of crimsontate.com. So let's check out what she picked for this box and what we're going to make with the contents. So just in case you've never heard of Quilty Box, basically it's a box of fun quilting gear that arrives once a month. Just kind of like a magazine subscription, except it's a box of gear instead. And we've got a variety of things picked for us by Heather Gavins of crimsontate.com. So she has picked out some arfil thread. This looks like some embroidery floss that you can divide and stitch with. And then we've got a little quilt pattern to make this cute quilt. And that is going to coordinate really nicely with this line of fabric. It's Wyndham Fabrics, and I think that's 8 or 9 fat quarters. So that'll be really useful. We've got some fabric markers. I've never heard of these before. These are tulip fabric markers. So that'll be fun to play with. And then story patches. I just recently heard about story patches. Basically, it's kind of a QR code that links to a video or content, and you can put it on, use it as a quilt label. And so let's say you make a quilt for a grandchild years and years down the road, they can scan that QR code and then see whatever you filmed for them. So I think that's really, really cool. So let's check out the fabrics. This is always the best part of every Quilty box, is opening up the fabrics and seeing what's inside. And these are paper obsessed. So it's all fabrics that are inspired by paper and love of correspondence. I saw this one and I really loved it. It's notebook paper. That's what it looks like. And then this one might be hard to see. It is paper airplanes, but it's a white on white, so it's kind of hard to see. But we've also got some stripes, and this looks like stamps, like all different kinds of stamps printed on fabric. And then these are letters and words printed. It's very small scale. And then we've got some stripes, some different types of stripes. I really like the variety we've got in this Quilty box. Just lots of different types and textures of prints, and then one more of the stamps. So I'm going to take a look at all this fabric, throw it in the wash, and get it pre-washed and ready to go. And I'm thinking to make something paper piecey with all this beautiful paper obsessed fabric. So I have decided to design a paper pieced quilt. This is called the Paper Airplane Quilt. And you can see we are going to create a paper pieced block. We're going to sew them together, and that's going to create the paper airplane, the triangle block. So what you're going to need to do is find this free quilt pattern at leahday.com, and you're going to want to print 7 copies of the patterns. You're going to have a left side and a right side print, 7 copies, and make sure to measure this 1-inch square. This should measure 1 inch after printing. If it doesn't, double check your printer settings and print it properly, and that should measure 1 inch. The square itself should measure 7.5 inches around the outer dashed line. Okay, so the next step is to start with piece number 1, and that's that biggest piece, or actually the second biggest piece right here, and we're going to use our fabric that came in the Quilty box, place that right on top, and I'm just going to pin it in place. And with paper piecing, kind of the tricky part about it is just knowing, kind of which side to focus on. And so the side that I really like to focus on is this side because it's got all the lines on it. So once I get the first piece placed, I fold up the paper so I can see where my edge is. And I'm going to grab my next piece, and I'm using this is a black batik, and I know it's going to go below. It's going to go in this area, the piece 2 fabric B. And I can fold that back, and I only need about a quarter of an inch of fabric B extending beyond this paper. That looks really good. I can fold that back, and if you need to, you can pin it in place. I can just grab all these layers, take it to the machine, and we're going to stitch right along that line between piece 1 and piece 2. So I've placed this in the machine, and I'm just folding back the paper and making sure I've got my pieces in place. I've got piece number 2 right here, and it's extending beyond the edge of that line. I've got, this is piece number 1. This is our nice fabric from the Quilty box, and it needs to be face down on the table so that way it's going to be right side out whenever we finish our quilt block. And now I just stitch right along that line. And it's just stitching right on the line between pieces number 1 and number 2. I might stitch off just a bit, and I do want to make sure that fabric extends beyond that outer dashed line because we're going to use that line to trim up the blocks later. We want more than enough fabric all the way around. So here's what things are looking like from the right side of the block or the back side of the paper piecing. I'm going to take that fabric B piece, that piece number 2, and finger press it over right along that stitching line. And then I want to fold back the paper and trim the excess fabric. You know, this is way more fabric than we need here. So I'm just going to grab a pair of scissors and just carefully trim this back. And it can be less than 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, more than 1/4 inch. It really doesn't matter. Just trim it back nice and neat just to minimize the bulk in that seam. Okay, and we'll flip back the fabric and now give it a good press. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to piece number 3, and that's this diagonal piece that runs across the block. And again, I'm going to fold my paper over so I can see where I'm working. So now I'm going to place another fabric B. This is piece number 3. It's a long strip, and I'm going to place that right side up. I'm of course using a solid color fabric, but if you're using a print, then it's right side up on your table. Put the block on top of it and fold that paper over. Grab the whole thing, take it to your machine, and this time stitch along the line between the inner unit, piece number 1 and piece number 2, and piece number 3. So you're going to stitch along that line. So I've pieced that line, and now I fold this piece over. Just a quick finger press, and then again, pick the whole thing up, fold the paper over so you can see it, and trim away the excess seam that you don't need. And I'm trimming down a little bit smaller than 1/4 of an inch. I'd say it's like maybe 3/16 if you're really getting, really picky about it. I just kind of eyeball it, trimming down so it's nice and narrow. It doesn't have to be a really big chunky seam allowance. So there is the block looking really good. Now we'll flip it over and fold it down, right on the diagonal, corner to corner. This is our last fold for our last piece. We're going to take our fabric A triangle. This is the background fabric. It's the most dominant fabric in the quilt, and it can be any color. I think a gray or a print would be really pretty. I'm just using white here, but really you could use anything you've got in your stash. You've got enough fabric for. Okay, and again, I am making sure that that folded, I've got at least 1/4 of an inch of fabric extending beyond. And you'll notice I have way more of this fabric B, the black fabric, than I need. I have you cut those a little wide, simply just in case, something gets wonky in the placement, it's still gonna work out really well. Okay, so everything's layered together, and now I'm going to stitch corner to corner along that line between piece 3 and piece 4. Okay, last piece, folding it over, again, giving it a good finger press, and flipping that paper back so it's easy to trim away all that extra seam allowance. Flip the paper back and that piece over and give it one final press. So that is half of our block. You want to follow the exact same steps and piece a block right side. And now the next step is to trim this down. You can see we have all this extra fabric all around the block, and we need to trim it down to 7.5 inches square. So one thing that I've noticed just with pressing and piecing, sometimes the block can shrink ever so slightly. The paper can shrink slightly. So the best rule of thumb here is to line up the diagonal line with that diagonal line we've stitched. Make sure it's nice and centered up. and then trim with the block. And remember, always trim with your dominant hand and always make sure that the block is facing you, that you're cutting away from you, rather than like making a shortcut and cutting across the top. That's how I cut myself a few weeks ago. So now I'm lining up again. And as you trim up more edges, you want to make sure to be lining up the block with the 7.5 inch mark and that diagonal line. So you've got multiple things to line up at once, and that's going to make it that much more accurate. So there's the left side, and here's the right side of our block. You can see how these line up so beautifully together. The next step is to flip over one side, so the right side's together, and we're going to piece the seam with an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I've lined up the two halves of my block together, slip them under the foot, and start piecing. And while, yes, I am leaving the paper in place, I'm not really using the line on the paper because, like I said, the paper with pressing and piecing can shrink ever so slightly. It might not be coming out at exactly 7.5 inches. So I'm just using the edge of my piecing foot as a guide, keeping that nicely lined up, making sure everything's lined up all the way down. So here's our finished block. I'm just going to flip it over and open up the seam allowance. Now, with the paper piecing, we are not able to open those seam allowances as we paper piece. Those are all folded to one side. But as we piece blocks together, we can go on ahead and open up that seam allowance so that way it'll be much easier to quilt. So give that a good press. Flip it over and you can see the beautiful block, how everything lines up together. So going ahead and piece a lot of these, you can see the different beautiful effects that we get from the beautiful fabrics in this month's Quilty box. I think these came out really, really nice. I'm going to take these, piece 7 of them together to create the long row of airplane blocks in a pattern, and then attach just background fabric to both sides, and the quilt will be complete. So that's it for our paper airplanes quilt. I think this turned out so well. The blocks are beautiful, and we've got all this beautiful negative space to play with when we go to quilt it. If you'd like to make the paper airplanes quilt, you can find the free quilt pattern at leahday.com. Until next time, let's go quilt.
Hey folks, don't forget to subscribe to Mom's video. She keeps on making new ones every Monday. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends.